People say weddings are supposed to be the happiest days of your life. They say love makes everything glow brighter, that family gathers, hearts soften, and past wounds finally heal. But on my wedding day, standing beneath soft white lights and fresh roses, I learned a painful truth. Sometimes the people who smile at you the most are the ones sharpening their knives. My name is Eleanor Wright. I was 62 years old when I decided to marry again. For years, I had told myself I was done with love. My first husband, Robert, had passed away after a long illness that drained not only his body, but also my spirit. I spent 12 years as his caregiver, his nurse, his anchor. When he died, the silence he left behind was so loud it followed me into every room of my house. The bed felt too big. The walls felt too empty. And my heart felt retired. I poured everything into my son, Daniel. He was my only child, the center of my world. I raised him with everything I had, working 2 jobs when Robert got sick, skipping meals so he could afford college books, hiding my own exhaustion so he could believe life was stable. When Daniel married Melissa, I welcomed her like a daughter. I truly believed that one day, when my hair turned white and my steps slowed, they would be there for me. But life doesn't always reward sacrifice with gratitude. I met Harold Turner on a Tuesday afternoon at most unromantic place imaginable, the public library. I was reaching for a book on the highest shelf when a calm, steady voice behind me said, "Careful. Those ladders have a habit of lying." I turned around and saw a man with kind eyes, neatly combed gray hair, and hands that looked like they had built things, fixed things, carried weight quietly. He smiled politely, not the confident grin of a younger man, but something softer, something respectful. From that day on, we started running into each other by accident. Coffee turned into conversations. Conversations turned into long walks. Long walks turned into laughter I hadn't heard from myself in years. Harold was 70. A retired maintenance supervisor, widowed, lived simply, drove an old truck, wore plain clothes. He didn't talk about big achievements or show-off stories meant to impress, but he listened, really listened, and when he held my hand, it felt safe, steady, like something that wouldn't disappear overnight. When I told Daniel I was dating someone, his smile was thin. "That's nice, Mom," he said, though his eyes flipped away. "As long as you're happy." Melissa wasn't even that kind. "How old is he?" she asked, her lips tight. 70, I replied calmly. She laughed. Not a gentle laugh, a sharp one. "Wow, so you're robbing the retirement home now?" Daniel chuckled awkwardly. He didn't stop her. That was the first crack, when I told them Harold had proposed. The room went cold. "Mom, don't you think this is a little fast?" Daniel said. "And I mean, what's the point at this age?" I stared at my son, the boy I once rocked to sleep. "The point is that I'm alive," I said quietly. Melissa crossed her arms. "Just make sure he's not after your house." Harold never responded to their comments. He never defended himself. When I told him about their doubts, he simply said, "They're protecting what they think is theirs. Give them time." Time, unfortunately, only made things worse. They insisted on a small wedding, not for intimacy, but because, as Melissa bluntly put it, there's no need to make a big deal out of something like this. I agreed because I didn't want conflict, because I was tired, because I still hoped they would come around. On the day of the wedding, Harold stood beside me in a simple suit. His hands trembled slightly as he held mine, not from weakness, but from emotion. I could feel it. Daniel arrived late. Melissa wore a dress that screamed for attention, white adjacent enough to make a statement. During the ceremony, I caught them whispering, smirking. At the reception, it got worse. I heard it before I saw it. "So this is the lucky guy?" Melissa said loudly, not bothering to lower her voice. "He looks like he should have been escorted." Here with a walker, Daniel laughed. Careful, Mel. Don't push him too hard. He might break a hip. People around them shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at me with sympathy. Others looked away. Harold heard it all. He simply smiled and sipped his water dot. Then Melissa raised her glass. I just want to say congratulations to my mother-in-law, she announced, voice dripping with fake sweetness. It takes courage to start over even when your groom is basically an antique. A few nervous laughs followed. My hands shook. My chest burned. I looked at Harold, expecting pain, embarrassment, anger. Instead, he leaned toward me and whispered, "It's okay. Let them talk." Daniel added, "Yeah, Mom, as long as you're happy with your old man." That word. Old man. Something shifted. In the room, Harold slowly stood up. He adjusted his jacket, calm and unhurried, and looked around the room with eyes that suddenly felt different, sharper, colder, like a man who had spent his life being underestimated and finally decided he was done. "I suppose," he said evenly, "since I'm being discussed, I should introduce myself properly." The room fell silent. Daniel smirked, crossing his arms. Melissa rolled her eyes. Harold looked directly at them and said, "You see an old man, that's fair. I am old, but what you don't see is everything that comes with surviving long enough to become one." I felt my heart race. "This wedding," he continued, "is not the beginning of my story, and it's certainly not the end." He paused, then added quietly, "And before this night is over, you'll understand exactly who you've been mocking." The silence was heavy, uncomfortable. Melissa scoffed. "Is this supposed to be a speech?" Harold smiled, this time without warmth. "No," he said, "it's a warning." And in that moment, I realized something extraordinary was about to be revealed. Something that would change how everyone in that room looked at the old man forever. The room stayed frozen after Harold's last word. Warning. The music that had been playing softly in the background faded into an awkward silence. Forks hovered mid-air. Conversations died halfway through sentences. Everyone suddenly seemed very interested in their glasses, the tablecloth, anything except the man standing calmly at the center of the room. Daniel let out a short laugh, trying to break the tension. Okay, he said, waving a hand. "Let's not turn this into some kind of drama. It's a wedding." Melissa leaned closer to him, whispering loud enough for a few nearby guests to hear. "If this is some sad attempt to sound important, it's kind of embarrassing." I wanted to disappear. My cheeks burned, not with shame for Harold, but with shame for my own child. I had raised Daniel to be kind, to respect people. Yet here he was, mocking a man who had shown nothing but patience and grace. Harold didn't react, not immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the head table, his steps measured, deliberate. He didn't rush. He didn't glare. He simply moved with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime knowing exactly where he was going. "Sit down," he said gently to me, placing a hand over mine. His touch was warm, grounding. "Let me handle this." Daniel frowned. "Handle what?" Nobody asked for. Harold raised a single finger, not aggressively, not angrily. Just enough to silence him, and surprisingly, it worked. "I've spent most of my life," Harold began, "being invisible to people who thought loud voices and expensive suits were the same thing as worth. I learned a long time ago not to correct them. Most of the time, it's not necessary." He glanced around the room, his eyes briefly meeting those of our guests as neighbors, old friends, a few distant relatives of mine, and several people from Daniel and Melissa's social circle. "But today," he continued, "you've made my wife's happiness a joke, and that is something I don't ignore." My chest tightened when he called me his wife. The word felt powerful, Final. Melissa scoffed again. Oh, please. We're just being honest. You can't expect us to pretend. This isn't strange. Harold tilted his head slightly. Honesty without respect is just cruelty dressed up as confidence. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Daniel crossed his arms. Look, Harold, no one's saying you're a bad guy. We just don't see why you need to act like some big deal. You're retired. You're old. It is what it is. Old. That word again. Harold smiled faintly. You know, he said, I was younger than you are now when I learned how dangerous it is to underestimate people based on appearances. Daniel rolled his eyes. Here we go. Harold reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. My heart skipped. For a split second, panic flashed through the room. But he didn't pull out anything dramatic. No envelope. No flashy object. Just a worn leather wallet. He opened it slowly and removed a small, faded photograph. He held it up, not theatrically, but enough for those closest to see. The photo showed a much younger Harold. His hair was dark, his posture straight. He stood beside several other men, all wearing identical uniforms. Serious faces. No smiles. Behind them was a structure that looked industrial, almost military. Daniel squinted. So, you were in the army? Lots of people were. Harold nodded. Yes, many were. But not all of them did what we did. He placed the photo gently on the table. I didn't retire because I was tired, he said. I retired because I finished. Melissa laughed sharply. Finish what? Fixing light bulbs? A murmur rippled through the room. Someone gasped softly. Someone else whispered, That's uncalled for. Harold finally looked directly at Melissa. His eyes weren't angry. They were calm in a way that felt unsettling. For 32 years, he said, I worked for organizations that do not advertise their accomplishments. Places where your name doesn't go on a door and your success is measured by disasters that never happen. Daniel's smile faltered. You're exaggerating. Harold nodded again. That's what most people think, until they don't. He turned to the crowd. I was part of infrastructure recovery teams after national emergencies, blackouts, collapses, failures that, if left uncontained, would have cost thousands of lives. My job was to go where systems had failed and make sure they never failed again. The room grew quieter. One of the older guests, a man with silver hair and a veteran's posture, stared at Harold, his expression slowly changing. Recognition flickered across his face. Wait, the man said cautiously. Turner, Harold Turner? Harold looked at him and smiled. Yes, sir. The man stood up abruptly, chair scraping against the floor. You worked on the East Coast. Grid restoration after the '03 blackout. Harold inclined his head. I led one of the night teams. The man swallowed hard. You saved my brother's hospital wing. Power came back just in time for emergency surgery. A hush fell over the room. Melissa's mouth opened, then closed. Daniel looked between the two men. This is ridiculous. That was decades ago? Yes, Harold said calmly. It was. And I didn't do it for applause. He turned back to Daniel. But here's what matters, he continued. Your mother stood by one man as he slowly disappeared into illness. She gave up her youth, her comfort, her dreams, and never once asked for praise. When she finally chose happiness again, you decided to humiliate her. I felt tears sting my eyes. I didn't raise my voice when you mocked me, Harold said. I stayed quiet because I was watching something far more disappointing than disrespect. Daniel clenched his jaw. You don't get to lecture me about my mother. Harold stepped closer. I do, he said softly, because I love her. And because I earned the right to stand beside her. The room was completely silent now. Melissa shifted in her seat, suddenly uncomfortable. This is all very dramatic, she muttered. You still haven't proven anything. Harold looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're right." He reached back into his jacket, and I suppose it's time I stopped asking you to imagine who I am. My breath caught because this time, whatever he was about to reveal felt like it would change everything. Harold's hand remained inside his jacket for a long second. The room felt like it had stopped breathing. Daniel shifted uncomfortably, trying to regain control of the situation. "You know what?" he said sharply. "This is enough. You're turning Mom's wedding into some kind of performance." Melissa nodded quickly, relief flickering across her face. "Exactly. No one asked for your life story. Let's just eat and move on." Harold finally pulled his hand out. This time, it wasn't a photograph dot, it was a small, plain metal badge attached to a folded document. No bright colors, no dramatic symbols, just an official seal and a name typed neatly across the top. He placed it gently on the table. "I never talk about this," he said quietly. "Not because I'm ashamed, but because it was never meant to be entertainment." The older man who had spoken earlier leaned forward, squinting. His face went pale. "Oh my God," he whispered. Daniel frowned. "What? What is it?" The man stood again, his voice unsteady. "This isn't military. This is Federal Infrastructure Command, Emergency National Response." Melissa laughed nervously. "People fake documents all the time." Harold turned toward her slowly. "You're right, they do." He looked toward the back of the room. "That's why I invited someone I rarely speak to anymore." A door near the entrance opened. A tall man in a dark suit stepped inside, scanning the room with practiced awareness. His posture was rigid, controlled, the kind of man who didn't waste movement. When his eyes landed on Harold, his expression changed instantly. He walked forward and stopped in front of him. "Sir," the man said clearly. "It's good to see you again." "Sir," that single word hit the room like thunder. Daniel's face drained of color. Who is this?" The man turned to him. "My name is Michael Reynolds. I currently serve as Deputy Director for Emergency Systems Oversight." A few guests gasped. "I worked under Harold Turner for 11 years, Reynolds continued. "He trained me, saved my life during a containment failure in Nevada, and personally shut down a cascade event that would have left half the Southwest without power for months." Melissa's lips trembled. This is insane." Harold raised a hand slightly. "Michael, you didn't need to come." Reynolds shook his head. "Yes, I did. You spent your life preventing disasters so others could sleep peacefully. The least I can do is make sure you're not disrespected on your wedding day." The silence was crushing. Daniel swallowed hard. "Why didn't we know any of this?" Harold looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse, disappointment. "Because you never asked," he said. "And because your mother didn't raise you to value people based on their titles." I couldn't stop the tears anymore. They streamed down my face, not from sadness, but from the sudden realization of how deeply wrong I had been about my own family. Melissa stood abruptly. "So what? This means we're supposed to apologize?" Harold met her gaze. "No, it means you're supposed to learn." He turned to Daniel. "You mocked me because I was quiet," Harold said. "Because I didn't demand attention. Because I didn't arrive wrapped in wealth or status. But real strength doesn't announce itself." Daniel's voice cracked. "Mom, I didn't mean..." I stood up then. For the first time that night, I found my voice. "Yes, you did," I said softly. "You meant every joke, every whisper, and you let her humiliate the man I love." Daniel stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. "I didn't marry Harold because he's powerful," I continued. "I married him because he sees me, because he treats me with dignity, because after a lifetime of giving, he gave me peace." Melissa looked around the room, realizing the tide had turned. Faces that once nodded along with her sarcasm now watched her with quiet judgment. This isn't fair, she muttered. Harold smiled gently. Neither was today. But fairness has a way of arriving late. Reynolds stepped back. Sir, I'll take my leave. Congratulations to you both. As he walked out, the room buzzed with whispered conversations. Respect, shock, regret. Lowered his head. I'm sorry, he said, barely audible. I was wrong. Harold nodded once. That's a start. But I could see it. Clearly now, this wasn't over, because apologies spoken under pressure don't always come from the heart, and the real test, the one that would decide whether my son truly understood. The cost of his cruelty was still waiting.